Photography is really all about light. It's almost a science of light. Without enough light, our lenses, not to mention our eyes, we have to strain. And with too much light, we can do little or nothing either. So most macro work that I do is in less than too much light. In fact, broad sunlight is blinding and pretty much unworkable for me. This is why I depend on diffusers and reflectors, but mostly on diffusers. On a bright day, I need something between the sun and my subject. That's why early mornings and evenings are best for my photography. However, I'm usually too tired to do much in the evening, so as summer comes on, I like to get out there earlier when it's crisp and cold, earlier and earlier each day in order to catch the light and to feel that coolness. I also do a lot of photographing in the woods or in places where shadows and light come together in the same photo frame. Often this is under a canopy of leaves. There may be a shaft of pure sunlight piercing the shade and striking the plants on the forest floor. This makes for great photos, but more often than not, the shaft of sunlight is just too pure, too bright by contrast with the softer shadows, and it becomes very difficult and sometimes impossible to balance the lighting later when I'm in post-processing. Somehow the sunlight has been too blown out to really for me to pull it back into line. So it's at these times that I use a diffuser, and I place it in the path of the sunlight and above the subject on the forest floor. And I tend not to use your standard Photoflex translucent diffuser because it's too opaque, unless I'm out in the full sunshine, which I don't like to do. But rather, I have my own home-brew diffuser made of some gauze-like fabric that filters the sunlight and tones it down just enough rather than removes it or blocks it entirely. The effect is more like one that we would get if we used a standard window screen to filter the light, which is another pretty interesting thing. Luckily, these little diffusers easily fold down to something that fits into my kit or even into a pocket. Most commonly, I use a 22-inch circular diffuser, but I also have 12 and 32-inch diffusers that I sometimes bring along. You would be on point to ask me, where do I get the third arm to hold the diffuser if I'm focusing the stack with my left hand and clicking the remote trigger with my right? Well, the answer would be that I've done just about everything you might think when it comes to this issue. I have lodged diffusers in trees, in windows, propped them up on sticks, hung them by hooks and threads, clamps, you name it. And I have alternated holding the diffuser by hand and focusing and triggering the remote, which much resembles juggling 3 balls. When you're taking 15 or so shots or more, hand holding a diffuser is a real pain. Most often, I use a little device called a flower pod. It was designed by nature photographer Les Saucier, or Saucier, I don't know how that's pronounced. And you can read about that here. This is really a great device. It weighs about a pound. It collapses to less than 12 inches and expands to 45 inches. It's a miniature tripod with a little articulated arm. It works just like a charm. I let the flower pod hold my diffuser, and I carry it in a little over-the-shoulder kit bag along with two diffusers, one translucent and the other more regular opaque. Diffused light can turn a throwaway photo into one that's perfect. It's worth the effort. In fact, a general rule that I'm finding is that good macro and close-up photography takes not only time and patience, but it also takes the proper equipment. And there are different kinds of light, like deep shade. In deep shade, like in the woods, in little dells and woodland streams, I keep the ISO as low as possible. In fact, I always keep the ISO as low as possible almost everywhere. I open up the aperture, and I mostly work with still life. Then there's mottled shade. If I'm in shade but with shafts of sunlight, then I get out the diffusers, in particular the one that lets the most light through. I have spent years trying to believe that that little bit of sunlight filtering through on my subject would be offset by all the shade, but at least in my case that doesn't work. That little bit of sunlight is hot and either blows out or makes it very difficult to bring the whole image into balanced light back in post. I just use the diffuser and it works almost every time. Then we have what I call light shade. And I like to believe that light shade is still light and I don't need diffusers, but the resulting photos show that the edges of the subjects, even though not lit with direct sunlight, are still too bright and they tend to blow out a bit. So I just use the very coarse diffuser, the least opaque, and things work pretty well. The light that clings to the reflective parts of the subject is too bright for light shade. Then we have the photographer's favorite, which is called high overcast sky. This is traditionally the best light to photograph in because the whole sky acts like a vast diffuser. If the wind is down, so much the better. That being said, if there's too much light, even in a diffused sky, my resulting photos are almost always better off with the coarse diffuser, the one that is like a piece of gauze or window screen. For me, almost any kind of brighter light needs to be toned down. And last, and for me least, is direct sun. If it's direct sun, I either get out a full light tent of the correct size or use the traditional translucent opaque diffuser, whatever one is most opaque. Many times I'll even use my own shadow and I'll stand between the sun and the subject, and that works well too. And there are also reflectors. In addition to diffusers, I sometimes use reflectors of one kind or another. And they can be very useful to redirect and to shine light on the subject. I don't do this as much as I probably should, but I intend to. Mostly I am into diffusers. Also, I'm not above carrying around with me one of those little LED flashlights. Phoenix is one of the main brands. I have a couple of them, and one of them takes a single rechargeable AA battery and it works well. I was able to purchase a tiny diffuser that snaps over the lens and opens and closes like a cap on a hinge. These can be totally useful if you need just a little light, especially if you want to backlight the bell of a flower or a leaf, something like that. The problem with flashlights, like with diffusers, is that you need an extra arm to hold it, and I often use my little flower pod tripod to do this, and it works great. And let's talk about color spaces. If you are using Zerine Stacker, you are taking a set of TIFF layers into Zerine Stacker and saving the resulting stack as a TIFF file that goes back into Photoshop or Lightroom. Often the color space profile, which can be sRGB or Adobe RGB, or more preferably, like at least in Lightroom or Photoshop, ProPhoto RGB, it can be lost when you're going through Zerine Stacker. And depending on what viewer you use, the colors may or may not reflect the original. You can check this by looking at the original and certainly at the web version carefully. If the colors don't more or less match, then the color profile may have been lost. So that's my point here. In that case, load the file into Photoshop and convert the profile from whatever it is back to sRGB for web viewing. If there's no profile whatsoever, you may assign one in Photoshop, and both of these can be found under the Edit tab in the more recent versions of CS versions of Photoshop. One last thing, an inexpensive plastic double-sided hand mirror is a valuable assistant for reflecting light on a subject. I get a two-sided one, and I sand down one side so that it's opaque, and I get very gentle light from that. It's a useful thing that you can use once in a while. Another useful tip is to watch the light. This is more of a general photographic concern rather than limited to focus stacking. Pay attention to the light in your frame. If you have variable light, varying light, like a shaft of sunlight in a shady place, you may want to modify that shaft of light with the diffuser before you start your stack. I've thrown out more stack photos because I could not nicely tone down the hot spots where clipping had occurred than for any other reason. And clipping can occur as you stack down. You may not see it in your original frame, but by the time you've done 50 or 100 layers, you're into light that you didn't see. Or the light in the sky while you're stacking has totally changed, like a cloud came over the sun or the sun came out from behind a cloud. Carrying some small translucent diffusers with you, you can figure out some way, and it's often difficult, to position them to filter the hot spots while you step through the focus stack. The same goes for specular highlights, which are, like bright reflections on leaves or dewdrops or water. Tone them down in the field and don't count on post-processing to be successful in removing them or modifying them very well. Also, front to back, another very common mistake is not to catch the very tip of the front, the tip of the top of your subject facing you. You get back home, you have a perfectly stacked photo, except that frontmost part is out of focus, and it happens a lot. So, as a rule, I reach the front focus, and I back off until the whole thing is slightly out of focus, and then I stack forward from there to be sure that I get the tip of the top of the front of the subject when it appears, and I stack from there inward. Another way to ruin a shot is to have too much room between the front of your subject and the back of the subject, like a single blade of grass in the foreground or a stick, and then quite a ways back you get to the actual subject. If you can include the grass or stick in the composition and still resolve it, fine. But this is perhaps the most common way to produce large and unfixable artifacts in a stacked photo. It's literally a bridge too far. So I remove, or preferably tie back, whatever is intruding on my shot. And yes, Photoshop CS5 can remove extraneous objects pretty well, but so can you, and you can do it perfectly. Now don't forget your sensor. Cleaning your sensor takes on another whole meaning when you stack focus. That speck of dust or dust bunny that you'll find on a single shot photo that you can just click away in Photoshop becomes a long articulated line when you have 15, 20, or 100 layers that are stacked. And a line is not always as easy to remove if it passes directly through part of your subject. These are nasty, so be ready to clean your sensor if you are around dust, which means just get ready and take a look, take a shot, or actually take the lens off and look at the sensor before you go out, because I've ruined a lot of shots coming back and having little dust bunny trails all over the photograph. And touching up, if you imagine that you won't have to touch up or retouch your stacked photo, think it through. Focus stacking is a sampling technique like digital music. By definition, sampling means that something's not there, that you're sampling and leaving other things out. So you have gaps. When you bring the subject together to close those gaps, you get artifacts. More often than not, what is left out will cause unwanted artifacts in the final stacked photo. So anyway, plan to fix those if you want a finished-looking photo. Focus stacking requires and teaches that kind of patience. Let's go over briefly the different kinds of stacking. Now, let's talk about many layers. I started out stacking in the fields and the meadows, and it was some time before I started working in the studio. And that was usually when it was winter and I couldn't go outside anyway. So in the beginning, I stacked photos by turning the helicoid, the focus ring, on the lens. And from the very beginning, I always used a tripod. There are a few focus stackers out there who don't use a tripod, and they're proud of it. And one of them even does good work, but they are all the exceptions that prove the rule. They're the evil Knievels taking a chance. I suppose I could do it too, but why should I bother? There's no way that I would get better shots by doing handheld stacking. They could only, just by probability, be worse. Stacking on a tripod is hard enough without adding one more factor. Anyway, I always use a tripod. At first I did short stacks, anywhere from 3 to 10 layers, and I of course wondered why I had so many artifacts, and that was the reason. I needed to stack more layers, but many of you may want to start out as I did. Try your hand at short stacking, under a dozen layers. It will give you an idea of the technique, and it will certainly introduce you to artifacts right off the bat. And always stack sharp. I assume that because narrow apertures give better depth of field, that by stacking at higher apertures like f11, that I would get better stacked results. And of course, it's simply not true. If you just think about it, stacking focus is an alternative to trying to get more depth of field out of our lenses by pushing the f-stop to higher and higher numbers, to narrower and narrower apertures. What you want to do is to stack at the sharpest aperture for any particular lens. Sharpest is sharpest, and you want to stack at the sharpest aperture in order to get a sharp result. Stacking at higher apertures brings diffraction into view, and it starts to show up in your stacks. So do some research and figure out for each lens you have, what's its sharpest aperture. I mean, it's usually like f5.6. And yes, you get more depth of field as you stack up to narrower apertures, but you also begin to record diffraction on your photos. Anyway, stack at that aperture, and that's why we do focus stacking, to try to get the sense of depth of field. So we stack sharp, and then we build a stacked image of focus, and that's how we get depth of field, not by trying to push up the aperture. Now, there is a caveat. I find that for some types of stacking, where there is a lot of very fine detail, like lace in the subject, that pushing the aperture just one stop higher, narrower than maximum sharpness, does help to hold a little bit more of the fine detail. But I'm not certain of this, but it seems to be the case, and it could just be my imagination. Now, choosing between a helicoid or rail. Another prejudice that I had early on was stacking by hand by using the focus ring or the helicoid, as opposed to stacking by using a focusing rail. I wanted my stacking experience to be as easy and fun and as lightweight as possible. I didn't want to carry any more equipment into the field than I absolutely had to, and I was pretty adamant about this. I not only insisted on using the focus ring, but I made a virtue of just doing short stacks. You know, I got in there, shot a quick stack, and got out. This went on for too long, some time, and I thought that focus rails were only for the studio, for stacking something like the compound eye of a dragonfly. Anyway, there's nothing like the arrogance of a beginner. My short stacking approach eventually limited me to lenses with longer focal lengths, and great lenses like the Coastal Optics 60mm f4 APO, one of the sharpest and best corrected lenses there are, was not very useful because it had such a short focus throw. The helicoid only would turn something like 210 degrees, way too short compared to something like the Leica 100mm Elmarit R with a 710 degree focus throw. So, in brief, the focus ring, called the helicoid, on the Leica 710 degrees was very, very fine, while the Coastal Optics was 210 degrees of throw, not nearly enough, and it's wide enough at 60mm to make things worse. So such a lens like that with a short focus throw needs to be on a focus rail if you're going to do fine work. The focus throw on it is just too short, and it makes me wonder what the designer had in mind in the first place. Anyway, it was only very gradually and as I started getting into higher megapixel cameras like the Nikon D3X, that I was forced to discover the value of stacking on a rail. And I did not go gently into that good night. More megapixels like the D3X required more care in focusing, and the results were correspondingly more striking. I even fooled around with medium format cameras, in particular a Mamiya RZ67 Pro 2, in hopes of getting to the promised land of better photos, but I finally had to give that up. The GUI, the interface of the medium format cameras, were so prehistoric to my taste, and the results were not all that great. The Nikon D800E actually was a real game changer for me. Somehow that much larger sensor, 36 megapixels, crossed the threshold into a new realm. It was not easy to use, and it's not easy to focus, and I soon found myself depending more and more on focus rails in order to get the very finest work. But the results were far better than any camera I've ever used, and I've had almost all of the Nikon digitals from day one. So anyway, today I do a lot on focus rails. If you can tolerate them, you'll find that they're incredibly useful.